tonight on True Crime Talk. What happens when your family name is tied to the mafia, but you end up wearing the robe of a judge?
Today, we're talking with Judge Mike Randazzo, whose Italian roots trace back to the Sicilian Mafia, including Al Capone's Chicago outfit and the St. Louis Mafia.
For him, La Cosa Nostra wasn't just something from a movie or a history book. It was the backdrop of his childhood. He's here to share his story about the challenges he faced on the path to the bench and the crimes and struggles that shaped both his family and himself.
And at the heart of it all is his relationship with his grandfather, a man he admired deeply, even viewed as a hero, despite the troubling truths and deep flaws he uncovered along the way. This isn't just a story about the mafia, crime, or the justice system. It's about resilience, identity, and choice. It's about confronting your personal history and deciding to live a life of integrity and service despite it.
If you've ever wrestled with the weight of your past or the legacy handed down to you, this episode is for you.
This is another first for us here on True Crime Talk. We have our first judge joining us here today. We have the Honorable Michael Randazzo joining us because he has a new book coming out called Presiding Over Shadows, From Chaos to Order in the Court. Judge, how are you doing today? And welcome to True Crime Talk.
I am doing great. I really appreciate this outlet and you inviting me on. And I'm happy to be your first judge on your podcast.
We are an extended version of the WildBlue family, so we are happy to have you joining the WildBlue family and joining us here on True Crime Talk. Tell us, fill us all in for your experience, your journey, because I can't imagine that becoming a circuit judge is something that you just fall into, right? Did you always want to get into this line of work? When did you decide that?
The long answer, and it's going to sound like a lawyer answer, is I always knew that I wanted to do something in this field. And I'll give you sort of a quick synopsis. I should have never been a judge. In fact, like when I was born over a month premature. I spent over the first month and a half or month or so of my life in the NICU, and the doctors were worried about my condition. There were multiple times that I was kind of touch and go, and they literally prepared my parents for a child that was going to be developmentally delayed, and frankly, they said disabled, underweight. And so just literally from day one, I was fighting. And so that continued really through most of my life. I always had sort of this chip on my shoulder, and I couldn't really explain why, but I knew that there was just something that I needed to prove about myself. I was always sort of this underdog and never given really the chance that I thought I deserved or thought I needed. And so I really wanted to prove myself. There were some things that happened. I got into trouble when I was in high school, and I had a teacher who stood by me. And that teacher even put her job on the line. And she was willing to go fight for me, even if it meant her losing her livelihood. That inspired something in me. And her belief in me allowed me to continue working. And I got into college. She helped me get a full ride scholarship into college. Went to law school, struggled in law school. Initially really struggled in law school. There's a story that I tell in the book about I was dead set on dropping out, and sort of some divine inspiration kind of sparked me to continue. And it was the best decision I ever made. It really, really wasn't my decision alone. I felt like there was some true godly inspiration there. But I decided to continue. I worked and worked and worked, and still with kind of that chip on my shoulder, completed law school and then started practicing as a lawyer. I practiced as a defense attorney for a while, and another story in the book, it hit me that it was not for me. I had children of my own, and there were some things that I was having to do as a defense attorney that I was not comfortable with. And that was always my plan. I was going to be a defense attorney. I was going to protect the innocent and stand up for people that had been wronged and do all the things that are really like truly inspirational for a lot of people. And then I realized that I couldn't do it. I couldn't go home and face my children based upon the things I was doing in the courtroom. And so I knew I wanted to stay in the profession, and I got an opportunity to become a prosecutor. So I flipped sides, worked as a prosecutor for about 10 years. And there was a judicial spot that came open in an election. Judge who had been serving for quite some time decided he was not going to run for re-election. We worked really hard on a campaign. I was a candidate in an election where I was coming from the smallest county in a group of 5 counties. And so we had to work extra hard, kind of with that same chip on my shoulder. We worked through that election, and somehow I got elected. And I was 35 years old when I got elected to the bench, 36 years old when I took the bench, and then was 37 years old when I became the presiding judge of our circuit. The presiding judge in a circuit is the judge that is administratively responsible for all the other judges in the circuit. And it's an election amongst the judges. So it's sort of a kind of a prestigious or sort of a position that's in high regard for the most part. The judges in our circuit elected me to do that, and I took over and became the presiding judge. And through our research, believe the youngest presiding judge potentially in the history of Missouri's judiciary.
And due to your age, you're very obviously the new guard, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. I think that there's sort of this I don't like to use the word stereotype, but that's what it is. There's a stereotype of what a judge is, and it's what we've all been taught. It's an old white guy that sits on the bench. They're cranky. They're sort of just cantankerous, and they don't enjoy their life. They don't enjoy themselves, and they probably no longer need to be serving. That's kind of the image that we get. That's the image that is sort of that comes to my mind. Even still being a member of the judiciary, that's the image that comes to my mind. I'm young enough that I want to change that. I've been doing a lot of outreach and a lot of just kind of grounding. You know, I go out and there's people that when they meet me, they're like, that I would have never believed you were a judge. I like that. I love hearing that because that's the type of people that we need serving in the judiciary. It's not the people that we have always had. It's not the people that have just sort of that old guard that's always been kind of anointed. Like, this is going to be our next judge. I went out and listened to people during this last election, and I've taken everything that I learned during that election into the courtroom to try to make the changes that they want to see happen. And I'm young enough to do it, and I'm enthusiastic enough to do it. And I may be an old man when I see those changes, but I'm confident we're going to make those.
It's the old movie, My Cousin Vinny. It has poisoned the mind of the masses. When you were working as a defense counsel, did you do any work as a public defender?
Yes. Actually, while I was still in law school, I started working as an assistant in the public defender's office, not as an assistant public defender, but I was sort of a legal assistant for some time, did an internship with the public defender's office. And to be honest, the only job opportunity I had an offer for when I graduated law school was in the place where I had interned previously. I didn't even really go out and look for another job because I knew that offer was there and I knew I was going to take it. That's what I wanted to do. Like, that's what I was dead set on doing. I was going to be a public defender, and I was going to work my way through their system and just really, really become a really devoted litigator. And I did that, just not through the public defender's office for most of my career.
I gotta believe that it varies probably to a wide degree from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but can you talk about some of the complications and maybe even disadvantages that a public defender faces?
Absolutely. I discuss it actually pretty in depth in the book as well, but I will give an overview of kind of my belief about that. The public defender's office is appointed in Missouri to represent clients. They do not get to choose their clients, and they're appointed to represent people who are indigent. And so we have a Sixth Amendment right to be represented by counsel, and if you can't afford an attorney, one could be appointed for you. Most people have heard that. It's part of the Miranda rights. What that means in practice is lots of people who are poor, and indigent is the word we use, but people that don't have money to hire an attorney, they have to be appointed an attorney in a criminal case. And when that happens, we as a public defender, you don't get to pick that client. That client gets appointed for you. And so you get left with clients that are many times unreachable, sometimes homeless, but many times they're not the cooperative client who walked into your office and said, here's a bunch of cash, represent me. It's people who say, I got stuck with you as an attorney. And their outlook about the situation is usually not that great either. So their belief is that public defenders are sort of less worthy lawyers or less competent attorneys. And to be real honest, in my experience, in Missouri specifically, our public defenders are some of the best attorneys that I've ever worked with. And that is a huge misconception that you're getting some sort of a lesser attorney or lesser counsel. Now you're going to get an overworked counsel. And that's the other reality of being a public defender, is because all these people get appointed attorneys, the case numbers are so high that it's very hard to juggle all of the responsibilities to your clients. And it's specifically in individual cases that you need to really be doing. That was part of the reality that pushed me away from being a public defender. The other reality is just that sometimes you have to represent bad people that you don't wish to represent, or that you're not necessarily comfortable even representing, and you get stuck with it. And the truth is that is what ran me away from being a defense attorney. I could no longer represent clients competently and also be true to myself and live up to what I wanted to be outside of the courtroom.
Are there any individual cases or specific experiences from that time that really have stuck with you?
Yes. So there are cases throughout my career that have really stuck with me. I will tell you that the story about me leaving the public defender's office is set out in pretty good detail in the book. It's the story literally of my first jury trial that I ever tried. And it was somewhat graphic description of what happened to a young child, and the lack of remorse, the lack of sort of self-awareness on people's parts about what they actually did to this child and the effects that it had on the child. That case actually is the only one I'd specifically discuss in the book because I think it's relevant as far as sort of shaping me, shaping my career, shaping the things and the choices that I made. I will say, as far as cases that stuck with me, that the one case that I was discussing about the child, he was basically tortured. This child was tortured by relatives of his, and I got appointed to represent one of his relatives as a public defender.
Were you a dad yourself at that time too?
I was.
Yeah, that would be tough.
And there was... I was torn. And I knew being that torn professionally versus privately, I couldn't keep doing it. That's all I ever wanted to do as far as career, but I knew that I couldn't continue doing that because of the little boy that I had to go home and face after I did that.
I've always wondered if defense attorneys are obviously crucial to our justice system, but does it ever leave you with any regrets?
Yes. I mean, I felt so that case specifically that I was talking about, I felt dirty. It felt like I was in some way implicit in what happened. And to give away the ending, There was a conviction in that case. I lost, and I lost badly. And my acceptance of that losing, that's the first time in my life that I'm so competitive. That's the first time in my life where I lost, and I was like, I'm okay with it. That's never happened. I'm competitive to a fault. And I was okay with losing in that situation, and I knew because I was okay with that, I didn't need to do that anymore. Mm-hmm. And that competitive spirit, that competitive edge, that carried over with me to the prosecutor's office whenever I moved over there. And I got to try a lot of really bad cases and help a lot of victims through the worst times in their lives. And that was so rewarding to me. It was the opposite feeling, as sort of dirty as I felt representing some of the defendants that I was appointed and forced to represent. I felt cleansed in a way by representing the state and prosecuting people, making sure that they were not out doing these things in the community, or that they were paying for the things that they did. And in another way, at my obligation as a father, like I was helping to keep my community safer by taking these people off the streets who potentially could even be harming my own child at some point.
And I would imagine that experience, once you change sides to a prosecutor, your experience as a defense attorney would really inform that new role, and then even as a judge today.
Yes, absolutely. And so I learned how to analyze cases from both sides. I learned how to anticipate, which is a huge skill that if I could teach young lawyers, the best thing you can do is anticipate what's going to happen. Predictability is great. You need to be able to anticipate what's going to happen on the other side and be able to respond. And that's a huge skill for trial attorneys. I understood where the defenses were going to go. I also understood why certain things were going to happen the way that they did in the trial. And that became crucial. I mean, people like to get hung up on statistics about like how successful or how many cases you won, how many cases you lost as far as a trial attorney, or at least the public. And I say people, I will tell the public, any good trial attorney that tells you they've never lost a case is either one, they're either a liar, or two, they're not taking cases that are real controversial type cases. Because the trial itself is always so unpredictable. I've had cases that I said, this is a slam dunk winner, and juries acquitted a defendant. And I've had cases like, I don't know if I got enough here, and juries convicted quickly. And the unpredictability of it makes it that the very best of the best litigators in the world lose cases. And if somebody is a litigator and they've been doing it for very long and they tell you they've never lost a case, they're probably that first category, the liar.
How hard is the jury to read?
Early in my career, it was tough. It was not tough because I practiced law in the area where I grew up. I've lived in the same area here in Missouri literally my entire life. I've never lived more than 15 minutes from where I live right now. And I commuted to undergrad in college. I commuted to law school. And I struggled here in this area. But those struggles helped me understand the people of the area, and the jury pools are pulled from the people in our area. Early in my career, I thought I'm going to go up here and I'm going to speak this legalese and I'm going to sound like I'm, this really educated attorney, and I'm going to speak down to them and they're going to just buy into what I'm selling. And that was completely the wrong approach. What I learned as I progressed through my career was that I needed to explain to them, I am one of you. I'm doing your work. And I need to communicate with you in the way that we communicate outside the courtroom every day. And that's a skill that I still try to really honed today, but it's a skill that I think has made me as successful as I've become, because I understand that people don't like to be talked down to. And if you can't have a normal conversation with them, you're not going to connect.
Have you had any situations that you have to toss somebody from the jury?
Yeah, so plenty of times. We live in a very rural community, and lots of times people on the jury know each other. They know the defendant. They know me as the judge. They know, the prosecuting attorney, the defense counsel. They literally know everyone in the courtroom. And that in and of itself is not enough to just get somebody kicked sort of off of a jury. But it's knowing those things and then not being able to set those things aside and give the defendant, the state, or the plaintiff in a civil case and the defendant a fair trial. So can they set all of those things aside, and can they make a decision based only upon what's presented in the courtroom? And it's one of those things that we say that we can do that, but I don't know that we sort of understand that concept well enough to really believe that we can do it. Because the people that I know, even that come in front of me, I know things about them as a defendant, as a litigant in the case, as a plaintiff, and I handle all types of cases. I handle lots of criminal jury trials as a judge, but I also handle family law cases, domestic cases, divorce cases. I handle contract cases where the money or the amount in controversy is over $25,000. There's a whole wide range of people that appear in front of me, and I know some of them. What I have to do, and it's the same thing that a juror would have to do, is my connection to them. Is it something that I can't set aside? Is it something that I can say, if I make this decision, there's going to be something weighing on my conscience that either forced me to make the decision one way or the other, or that directed my decision making in a way that it should not have. And jurors in this are the same way. Now, we weed those jurors out during a process called voir dire. I say voir dire. Lots of fancy attorneys say voir dire and give it a little bit of flair. But I'm just a country boy who was just really lucky enough to find my way into law school, somehow pass it, get out and practice for a while, and was successful enough that I didn't ruin my reputation. Got elected to be a judge.
When you ran for election, what were you running on, or what? I know you said you wanted to bring some change to the bench. What did you want to bring?
So number one, change, and it just change of the sort of the old guard. There's just always been a way of doing things. A good, for instance, would be in domestic cases. It's been the law for quite some time that there's this presumption when there's children involved that each parent will get 50-50 custody. That has never really been the practice. Even though the law says there's this presumption that they should get equal custody, equal parenting time, equal visitation with their children, there's always been this presumption that mom's going to be the primary parent. Kids are going to get to see the dad on every other weekend and sometimes during the summer. And it sort of was this unwritten part of the law that's just the way that things happened. And people were frustrated with that. Like men and women, husbands and wives, both sides of that were frustrated with that sort of, this is the law, but this is in practice the way we do things. That's one of those things that I said, I'm going to change that. I also said that I was going to run on a victim-centered approach to justice, and that's the way that I've always did it as a prosecutor. Victims' voices are not heard enough in our system, and at many times, victims' voices were viewed as being sort of inferior to the rights of the defendant or the rights of the accused in the cases. And when we look at it from a victim-centered approach, now, when I was a prosecutor, I represented the state. I didn't represent an individual victim. And that's sort of a distinction that a lot of people don't understand. I didn't represent the victim in the case. I represented the state of Missouri, and I was seeking justice on behalf of the people of Missouri. including a victim who was victimized. But I ran on that approach that I was going to put victims' rights, at least giving them more priority and giving them a voice in my courtroom. And I believe I followed through exactly on every one of those promises that I made to change things. There's still a lot of work to do in our system. Our system is behind in technology. We try to use it in the courtroom. We try to sort of integrate that, and we're still sort of in the infancy in Missouri about using technology in our courtroom. Some of our locations have high-speed connections, but they're not reliable internet connections, and they're not reliable. The infrastructure doesn't exist really yet for us to do a lot of video or even sometimes audio things virtually. And so we have some strides to make as far as access to justice and as far as just accommodating people. But I want to see those things change as well, and I'm young enough that I expect that they're going to while I'm on the bench.
I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but you're in Missouri?
Yes. So
Okay.
I'm a circuit judge in the 42nd Judicial Circuit of Missouri. That's a 5-county judicial circuit. It's the largest judicial circuit by area in the state, but it's pretty sparsely populated. So we're a very rural area. So my circuit, sometimes I will be in a different county every single day of the work week. And because there are 5. And so my days are not like a regular day. I don't go to an office and sit in that office and the cases come to me. I have to go out courthouse to courthouse and go to the cases to hear those cases.
That is very different. Another thing that's very different here too is we spent so much time on your career that we didn't even get into the portion of your memoir that you say this memoir is my confession and my exorcism. Take us into that a little bit.
All right. I'd be happy to. So my last name, at least when people hear it, they think Italian. And what a lot of people in rural Missouri think about Italians are my cousin Vinny, the mafia, Godfather, all of the stereotypical like Italian things, pizza, like all of the things that you would think Italian. I inherited this last name. Inheriting this last name also inherited a lot of generational deviance. And so going back to my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Randazzo, he was a member of the St. Louis Mafia. And his brother-in-law, Mike Benigno, was a member of the Chicago outfit, going back to when Al Capone was the head of that faction. And they were mobsters. I mean, the reality is they were bad guys. And I say they were bad guys. Like, I've had conversations with everyone that knew my great-grandfather. I never got to meet the guy, but everybody that knew him and said he was just the most kind, gentle, sort of nice human being that they'd ever been around. Everyone that I know that knew him loved him. There was always this belief in our family that, we knew, or at least the story was, that he went to prison. And the story was that he went to prison for something sort of relatively minor, stealing apples, of all things. The story went, he stole some apples and he got caught. Sort of implicated he got set up a little bit and he went to prison. Well, when I learned what I started to know about the justice system, I kind of called BS on that story. So I said, that just doesn't sound right. There's always been sort of this air that we had family members that were in the mafia. There were people that we knew that were in the mafia, or that we were sort of in some way kind of adjacent to the Sicilian Italian mafia. Well, I started doing some digging, and I found some archives that had some information about my great grandfather, Joe Randazzo, and he went to prison because he was a heroin mule, and he was associated with all of the bigwigs, literally the Don of the St. Louis Mafia. And his brother-in-law, as I said, was a lieutenant in Al Capone's Chicago outfit. They sort of formed this triangle between St. Louis, Chicago, and Kansas City, and they ran that triangle as the mafia. And they controlled sort of trade routes. They controlled drug routes, guns, and even counterfeiting. And so, story in the book about my Uncle Mike, he's a notorious counterfeiter. And he got caught. He went down. He took the blame for himself, took the blame. My Uncle Mike served prison time. And when he was released, the day he was released, he was appointed the head of the Teamsters Union here in St. Louis, the day of his release from prison. And the local leaders were just in arms about that. Didn't last too long, his appointment to the head of the Teamsters, and he found his way down to Miami. And because he didn't snitch on anybody, he didn't take anybody down with him when he went down for counterfeiting, he served his time, and he was set up for the rest of his life. He went to Miami, became the head of the Miami Mafia, the faction that had moved on to Miami, became a nightclub owner, and got sort of tangled up with the cartels down there, and lived a life pretty much as a result of his commitment and his keeping his mouth shut about his involvement in the St. Louis area antics. They moved him to Miami and set him up for life, and he lived a good life for the remainder of his time that he was here. He is regarded in my family, even though those bad things, my Uncle Mike is regarded as sort of this one of the heroes kind of within the older guard of my family. Probably the greatest trajectory moment in my family's history was when they were excommunicated from the Mafia. My Grandpa Joe, his children were now getting old enough to where they were getting involved. My Uncle Frank was in, my Uncle Joe was in, and my Uncle Sam was, I think, 15 or 16-ish, somewhere in that area. He was getting ready to be in. He was going to join. And my grandpa, Nick, was also 13, 14. He was going to be joining before long as well. My grandpa made a decision about the trajectory of our family that definitely changed my ability to do the things that I've done in my career. In fact, I would have not been allowed to even pursue the career that I pursued had things continued the way that they were. So my Grandpa Joe went and asked for excommunication. There's only really one way out of the Mafia for the most part, and that's through death. My grandpa went and asked to be unmade. He went, had a discussion with my Uncle Mike. My Uncle Mike vouched for him, and my Grandpa Joe was allowed to leave the Mafia. One of the side effects of leaving the Mafia, though, was that you were dead to them. And it was as close to a death as you could get with still keeping your life. You didn't talk about the Mafia. You didn't talk about anyone you knew that was in. You didn't talk about anything that happened. If they ever found out that you did, you would be killed. And he was allowed to walk away. They walked away with really nothing. They walked away and sort of tried to regroup their lives. There was a lot of struggle from that point forward for the Randazzo side of the family. But some way, and I think really my Uncle Mike had a huge impact on that. But my Uncle Mike vouched for my Grandpa Joe and Grandma Rose, and they were allowed to leave. And it happened at a time before my grandpa was actually made or allowed to become part of the family business. And I will tell you, even on his deathbed, that was one of his regrets, actually, in his life, is that he never got to be a real gangster.
Did they ever talk to you about it? Did you hear these stories growing up, even though there was this kind of code of silence as time went on? Were they pretty open about it with you?
Not at all. Not at all. And that's like literally the story about my great grandpa going to prison. They said he went to prison because he stole some apples. He did steal some apples. I found a newspaper article where he stole some apples and got a fine. He got fined money. So he had to pay money, didn't go to prison, didn't go to jail. He paid some money. So that there was truth to that portion of the story. But I think that was the family's way of justifying like where grandpa had been for the last few years without saying, hey, he was pushing heroin.
So how did you learn everything that you have since about this?
This kind of started as just a discovery of me. I wanted to know about sort of who I was, where I came from, why, how we ended up where we ended up. That led me to some Ancestry.com stuff, but also to archives. I've just always been an investigator. It's really inquisitive by nature, and I wanted to investigate who he was, who my great grandpa was. He was the only Randazzo that I could go back to that I knew that lived in the United States. And we didn't have any connection back to Italy to know where the family even came from there. And I really wanted to know about our origins, knowing that they were Sicilian in nature and knowing that, where the name came from. But I wanted to know about these people as people. And doing that, I started looking at archives. I went to newspaper archives, went to just basically anything that I could find, and just started doing as simple a search as I could, and just followed everything down the rabbit hole. And I say the rabbit hole, like there were things that I discovered and got to share with my grandpa. One of the things that I'm most happy about at the end of his life is I got to share things about his family that he didn't know. My grandpa, Nick, never knew who his grandfather was. He never met his grandfather. He was named Dominic after Dominic Biondo, who was his step-grandfather. Dominic Biondo obviously didn't give my great-grandfather or my grandfather his last name or didn't provide it on to me. But Dominic Biondo was another one of those mob guys that my grandpa was named after. And I got to share with my grandpa what I believed his actual grandfather's name was. He didn't know anything about him. He didn't know anything about the Randazzo family other than his dad. His dad was a Randazzo. All of my grandfather Joe's brothers and sisters, who he had quite a few, their last names were Biondo. They were his siblings, but they were step siblings. They weren't Randazzos. And so I wanted to know just where this name came from. Sort of a story in the book about where I think the name came from and sort of how things unfolded. That's pretty speculative, but there's not much information about who my great-great-grandfather Randazzo was, if I actually have a great-grandfather Randazzo. There's a little bit of speculation in the book, although I don't take it to sort of the complete end, but there's some speculation that maybe my grandfather Randazzo's last name was actually not supposed to be or was not originally Randazzo. And that may have been an identity he assumed because of his mob ties.
Was he directly from Sicily? Did he come to the U.S. from Sicily?
Yes. So interesting story as far as his birth. My grandfather Randazzo, Joe Randazzo, was born on the ship that had disembarked from Italy on its way to the United States, where his mom was immigrating. And because the ship had left Italy as its last port, he was an Italian citizen. And so he never stepped foot on the island of Sicily or the country of Italy, but he was an Italian citizen. And he was naturalized here as a citizen of the United States at some point in his life. But he was born on the way to the U.S.
And you were delivered by a veterinarian, correct? This is like your
yeah.
family just loves complicated births.
Yeah. So I was born over a month early. Just a little bit of the background. Both of my parents were high school dropouts. I know that I was never the plan. And my mom started having complications with me. They kept giving her medications to try to delay the birth or delay her delivery. I guess her OBGYN, her normal doctor that was taking care of that, was on vacation because he didn't believe he had any sort of imminent birth coming. And because he was gone, there was not an OBGYN that was able to deliver me. And so they went with what I believe, or what I guess was the next best thing. So I was delivered by a veterinarian. Immediately after I was delivered, thank God, but the veterinarian knew that I was in distress, and I was placed in the NICU, and at least my initial care changed to try to stabilizing me and sort of save my life. And it was touch and go for some weeks, those first weeks of my life. There was a discussion with my parents about what to expect, and the complications that I was going to have in my life, and how hard of a child, how hard of an upbringing, how hard of the struggles that I was going to have, that I would be developmentally delayed, that I would be behind both cognitively and physically behind my peers.
You say that with your family, that every member of your family is both perpetrator and victim. And I know we went into that a little bit. We've touched on that already. Tell us a little bit more about your family.
There was never a priority to obey the law in my family. It's never, we've always ran afoul of the law, just historically. A big part of that, I think, stems from sort of the mafia connection. But other people in my family, every other person that I know in my family, including myself, I will include myself in this. Like, I have done things that either they've been convicted of or they have not been convicted of that were crimes on other people. And also, we're all sort of a shared victim, but many specific victims in this sort of family of things that have happened. For instance, my mother, she was a high school dropout. She was a cheerleader, and she liked to party, and lots of things happened to her as a result of that. When she was even younger than that, there was a time, and this is in very graphic detail in the book, but she was victimized violently, sexually. And I think that affected her life. But every person in my family has in some way ran afoul of the law. And as I said, as if it's been convicted or not, all of those stories are in the book. And really, my hope by telling these stories is sort of not just a confession of the sins, but to cleanse the next generation, my children, from those generational curses. I had a proclivity when I was younger for violence. I got into fights a lot, and I couldn't control sort of this rage that just burned in me at some point. I don't know if it was me believing I had to continue to prove myself, or had to sort of to fight. I got into fights frequently, and that was almost my undoing. That was almost the thing that stopped me from ever having a chance to succeed. And I want to be transparent about those things so that one, someone out there may have hope for their own situation, but for two, I want to cleanse this next generation, my children, from the burdens of those sins. I know that I didn't answer specifically about each of the instances, but I will tell you there are instances of crimes committed by my great-grandfather Joe, my grandpa Nick, my own father, my grandpa Bud, my grandpa Leach, myself. And then there are stories of victimization about lots of the women in my family. There's some stories that, I share about their victimization, but there are lots of things that have happened, from domestic violence and domestic abuse to sexual assault, prostitution, and some really bad things that I got permission to share those stories first, but I would not have shared otherwise, because those really, while they made me who I am, those aren't necessarily my stories to share without informed consent and their permission.
How were you able to eventually confront this and break this cycle for yourself?
It's sort of a hard question for me to answer, because I don't know that it happened. It wasn't like a light switch just flipped and all of a sudden I had changed, or that these things had changed about me or changed about my life. But I knew that I didn't want my family to be what this family has always been. I tried to change the things that had happened. And in my mind, I knew that the family was on a trajectory that I was not comfortable with, that I didn't want my children to be on. There were things that were just sort of acceptable. Drug usage, spousal infidelity, lots of things that happen that I'm not comfortable with condoning to my children. I'm also not comfortable with my children believing that the people that raised them, the people that are around them, and the people that gave them their DNA were perfect people. I want them to know all the good things about them, but I also want them to see the imperfections, because I think they can learn a lot about that as well. They can learn a lot about themselves. Like, there's times where we're not perfect. We make mistakes, including myself. I make mistakes all the time, every day. I think we learn more from mistakes and how we respond to those than we can learn from sort of believing that those things don't exist. Bad exists in this world, and I think sort of by being transparent about the bad things that have happened either to us or because of us, we can become better people altogether. And that, at the most basic reasoning about why I wrote this book, I wrote this for my kids. This didn't start out as a book, just as an explanation. This didn't start out as, I'm going to write this book and because I believe I'm an author. I'm not an author. I guess technically once publication happens, I am, but I'm definitely not a writer. And this book's about all of the things really that I never should have been. And that's another one of those things. I shouldn't be a writer. I shouldn't be a judge. And frankly, based upon the odds, I shouldn't be alive.
Our guest is Judge Michael Randazzo. He's a dedicated public servant, accomplished attorney, and respected community leader, and now an author, but more importantly, a father, of course. His book is Presiding Over Shadows, From Chaos to Order in the Court. It's a book about breaking the cycle of generational sin, a story of crime, courage, and hope. Go check it out. Judge, thank you for joining us here today on True Crime Talk.
I appreciate it.
Today's show is brought to you by WildBlue Press. Go to wildbluepress.com for everything true crime in the world of books, audio, Kindle, and paperback and hardback. Make sure you check out Presiding Over Shadows, From Chaos to Order in the Court by Judge Michael Randazzo. Thank you to Brian. Thank you to Carolyn. And of course, thank you to our guest, Judge Michael Randazzo. And thank you all for listening to True Crime Talk.